Thank you very much, Arthur. It's nice to be with all of you this morning. Um, so, as Arthur mentioned, I am a lawyer by training. I went to law school with a guy by the name of Joe Biden. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a good guy. Um, so, having said that, I just want to tell you a little bit more about myself. In terms of my career as a lawyer, I've always done public interest work, seeking justice, justice for poor people as a legal services for the poor lawyer in Rochester for 10 years, justice for prisoners as the executive director of Prisoners Legal Services of New York for 20 years. And now for the last 20 years, I've been working with End of Life Choices New York, seeking health justice for patients, and particularly those who are at or near the end of their lives. So this morning, I'm going to talk primarily about medical aid in dying because I think it's an extremely important option which people should have when they are dying. We have a 100% mortality rate in this country and actually throughout the world, and that's not likely to change in the near future. But most of our recent history, according to Atul Gawande in the New Yorker article in August of 2010, and the author of Being Mortal, he says that dying was typically a brief process. These days, swift, catastrophic illness is actually the exception for most people. Death comes only after a long medical struggle with an incurable condition. So about 90% of Americans now die from chronic, progressive, incurable diseases. People are living longer, but not necessarily better. And many chronically ill, seriously ill, and terminally ill patients have, among other things, poorly controlled symptoms, particularly pain, psychiatric disorders, and psychosocial and spiritual distress, concrete needs in the home, challenges in care coordination, communication, decision-making, and goal setting. I hope all of you have gone through the process of talking with loved ones and having appointed someone to be your healthcare agent. So if and when you can no longer make healthcare decisions for yourself, someone else will be able to make those decisions. This is extremely important. Why? Because most of us, about 70% of us, will lose the ability to make our own healthcare decisions near or at the end of our lives, and someone's going to have to be making them for us. And it's much better to have someone that's been appointed to be our healthcare agent to make those decisions rather than to leave it up to doctors or someone else who might be the person making decisions for you under what's called the Family Healthcare Decisions Act, something which we really don't want to have to rely on. So if there's anyone that's not gone through that process, and if you want more information about completing a healthcare proxy and becoming and having someone be your healthcare agent, please don't hesitate to contact me. So life, of course, for most of us is really precious, but it's going to end for all of us. As I mentioned before, about 150,000 New Yorkers every year. No dying person should have to endure more suffering than he or she is willing to endure. And every dying person who is mentally competent should have the right to die, if possible, in a way that she or he decides and controls, consistent with his or her values and beliefs. So for those who are dying, the issue is not whether they'll die, but how they're going to die and who makes decisions at life's end. Medical aid in dying should be an available option in addition to stopping or never starting treatment, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, and palliative sedation. So let me just back up a little bit and talk about what our rights are generally when it comes to healthcare. As long as we have decision-making capacity and the ability to make our own healthcare decisions, we can make any and all decisions for ourselves. That means we can accept or reject any healthcare treatment that is offered to us, and we can even stop treatment at any point in time when we feel that treatment is no longer beneficial, even knowing that death will result. The same is true when it comes to another way in which people might hasten their deaths, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, which has actually been proven to be a pretty good way of dying. According to one study now long ago, 2003, that was reported in the New England Journal of Medicine, 100 hospice nurses rated the the quality of deaths of their patients who had died by voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And on a scale of 1 to 9, by observation only, of course, they rated the quality of their deaths as an 8.5. So pretty good quality of death. But it's a process that does take some time, usually a week to 2 weeks. And so it's not something that people would rather choose if they had the option of medical aid in dying as an alternative. But it is a relatively good option for people who might not be on any life-sustaining treatment if they want to hasten their death when they feel that they can no longer go on living. So medical aid in dying occurs when a terminally ill, mentally competent adult patient who is likely to die within 6 months takes prescribed medications which must be self-administered to end suffering and achieve a peaceful death. And I've really studied this issue for about 20 years now. So I can tell you a lot of things about medical aid in dying, and I'm going to, in terms of why I think it's a very good, reasonable option for some people, even if a very limited number of people at the end of their lives, and why there aren't any good arguments in opposition to medical aid in dying, which should prevent this option from becoming law across the country. So medical aid in dying is not just a reasonable end-of-life option, but a better choice for some terminally ill patients than other ways in which death may be hastened. I think that's pretty clear based on all the evidence coming out of the 10 states and District of Columbia, which now authorize the option. Most importantly, medical aid in dying has been proven to be a safe, ethical medical practice which benefits patients and families and causes no harm to anyone. It occurs throughout the country, but in states other than those where it is now authorized, it is done underground, unregulated, and may not be legal. The practice should be legal, above ground, and reasonably regulated. Physicians and family members should not be at risk of punishment. Going back to Rochester, where I'm from, Dr. Timothy Quill, who was for many years the director of the palliative care service at the University of Rochester Medical Center, actually helped one of his patients to die who was suffering terribly at the end of her life with medications. He wrote about it in the New England Journal of Medicine in an article, and then was prosecuted by the district attorney of Rochester. I was no longer in Rochester. I didn't know Tim Quill at the time. I've gotten to know him very well since 1989, actually since 2000. But in any event, the case was presented to a grand jury, and the grand jury refused to indict Dr. Quill. I suspect that the reason is that after Dr. Quill testified, the grand jury found that he was only doing what was right for his patient, what his patient wanted. He was doing it out of respect for her and did what he felt, again, was right. So we have medical aid in dying now in this country in 10 different states, mostly Western states, but also in New Jersey and in Vermont. We have had a bill pending in our New York State legislature for 7 years now. I went to my assembly member, Amy Paulin in Westchester, and asked her to sponsor a bill, which she did. She is the lead sponsor in the assembly. The bill now has some 73 sponsors, and I'll talk a little bit more about the bill at the end of my talk. But I do want to talk about why medical aid in dying should be supported by all of us, and why you folks at the Ethical Humanist Society of Long Island, since you are social activists, if possible and appropriate, should take a position in support of medical aid in dying. So first, medical aid in dying is not assisted suicide, which many people claim that it is, and courts have made the same kind of decision, but there are really stark differences between suicides and medical aid in dying. People who die by suicide usually have a mental illness. They can continue to live, but choose not to. Suicides are often done in isolation, often impulsively and violently, and they are tragic. To the contrary, medical aid in dying is available only to terminally ill patients who will soon die. Their disease is what's killing them. The process usually takes at least several weeks from the time a prescription is requested and taken, if ever, and about 1/3 of people who receive a prescription, by the way, never take it. And it occurs after consultation with two physicians who determine that the patient is in fact terminally ill and has decision-making capacity. And it's almost always done with family support. The process for these people who die by this means is empowering. The term assisted suicide is rejected by numerous organizations, including the American Public Health Association, the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine, the American Medical Women's Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Family Physicians, among others, and in all of the state laws and bills which authorize medical aid in dying. I should mention that even though the American Medical Women's Association is supportive of medical aid in dying, as is the American Academy of Family Physicians, that unfortunately the American Medical Association still has a position essentially in opposition, although there's been a lot of discussion about the issue over the past few years, but no change in position yet. In 2017, the American Association of Suicidology issued a statement entitled "Suicide is not the same as physician aid in dying," as they term it. And they give 15 points of distinction between suicides and medical aid in dying. I will just mention a couple of them. In physician-assisted dying, the individual who is already facing death often experiences intensified emotional bonds with loved ones and a sense of deepened meaning as life is coming to an end. In suicides, by contrast, the individual typically suffers from a sense of isolation, loneliness, and loss of meaning. The term and another distinction is the term suicide may seem to imply self-destruction, and the act may be cast that way in some cultural and religious traditions. Ending one's life with the assistance of a physician and with the understanding of one's family is often viewed more as self-preservation than self-destruction, acting to die while one still retains a sense of self and personal dignity before sedation for pain or the disease itself takes away the possibility of meaningful interaction with those around one. So there are real differences between typical suicides and medical aid in dying. The laws allowing medical aid in dying have worked as intended. There is evidence that deaths by medical aid in dying are at least as good, and in some cases better, deaths than others. There is evidence that family members of those who request medical aid in dying feel better prepared and accepting the death, and there are no negative effects, according to one study. About 90% of those in Oregon who end their lives by medical aid in dying are receiving hospice care, which means that even hospice can't meet all the needs of all dying patients. Almost all have health insurance, and most are college educated. But let me go back to the issue of hospice. A number of years ago now, in 2015, the former CEO of the Oregon Hospice Association wrote an op-ed piece that was published in the Sacramento Bee entitled "Hospice Care Isn't Enough for All the Dying." And what she said was that she was an opponent of medical aid in dying initially. She believed that, quote, it was unnecessary if terminally ill Oregonians had access to high quality hospice and palliative care. However, I came to realize that it was arrogant of me to believe that hospice and palliative care professionals could meet all the needs of the dying. Oregon is consistently rated among the best states for providing hospice and palliative care. Yet even with the best care, some patients still suffer intolerably and want the option to take prescription medication to die painlessly, peacefully, and quickly in their sleep. Then she finally says that today I am convinced that medical aid in dying can be and is practiced responsibly in Oregon. That explains why Oregon's law is the model for subsequent laws, and that while some healthcare professionals expressed fierce opposition to medical aid in dying prior to the law changing in Oregon, which has now had a law, by the way, since 1997, Since then, those voices have softened in the face of indisputable evidence, and no representative medical organization has called for the law to be repealed. That's how well medical aid in dying law has worked in Oregon, but the same is true in other states. A comprehensive medical cancer center in Seattle, similar to Sloan Kettering in New York, which implemented a program for patients to access medical aid in dying, found that, quote, overall, our Death with Dignity program, as they called it, has been well accepted by patients and clinicians. None of the problems expected or anticipated by opponents or skeptics of medical aid in dying have emerged. There is no evidence of disproportionate impact on any vulnerable populations, according to a study that was issued by and reported in the Journal of Medical Ethics in 2017. And that includes the poor, people of color, people without health insurance, the people with disabilities, the elderly, many of us. Nor is there any evidence of any coercion or abuse. There are stories which are presented here and there, and occasionally maybe there will be a case of coercion or abuse. But it is so rare that it cannot be a legitimate argument in opposition to medical aid in dying. With regard to those with disabilities, consider particularly a letter from the executive director, now former executive director of Disabilities Rights Oregon, which is their advocacy and protection agency there, in which he stated in 2016 that Disability Rights Oregon has not received a complaint of exploitation or coercion of an individual with disabilities in the use of Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. A former board member of a sister organization of ours, Compassion and Choices, gave a talk a number of years ago. He was in a wheelchair after a fall from a horse during some kind of a not a rugby match. I forget what's polo match. In any event, and he actually thought about taking his own life when he was now a wheelchair user. But what he said was that now, and he died a few years ago, but he said at the time, if I should face such a scenario, meaning that he was terminally ill in the future, and were I to lose what little control I have left over my body, then I will still want the right to make such a choice. But it would be a choice that should only be available to me if I carried a terminal illness. And that's what medical aid in dying is for. It's only for people who have a terminal illness and are expected to die within 6 months. Paul Spears, who the person I'm talking about, by the way, he was a neuropsychologist at Boston University School of Medicine and MIT. He said, it might not be your choice or that of 10 other people with disabilities or who use wheelchairs, but just as I would never presume to make a choice for you, please do not presume to make a choice for me. You do not have to somehow protect me from myself, from others, or from society. Just because I'm a wheelchair user, I prefer to protect myself. And many in our community resent and reject the assumption of vulnerability that is the basis of some opposition. So if you think about medical aid in dying, no more people are going to die as a result. It's only a question as to how these people are going to die and who is going to make the decisions. So there is, fortunately and understandably, I think, widespread support for medical aid in dying across the United States. A Gallup poll, which was issued in May of 2020, asked the question, when a person has a disease that cannot be cured, doctors should be allowed by law to end the patient's life by some painless means if the patient and his or her family request it. 74% said yes, 25% no. New Yorkers support medical aid in dying, according to a 2018 Quinnipiac University poll, including majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and conservatives, as well as those with different religious affiliations, by a 63 to 29% margin, over 2 to 1. Physicians in the US support medical aid in dying by an almost 2-to-1 margin, 55% to 28%, according to a 2020 Medscape poll. In New York, when doctors were given the Medical Aid in Dying Act and reviewed it, by more than a 3-to-1 margin, 67 to 19%, they supported the Medical Aid in Dying Act, according to a 2018 Medscape poll. So there are many arguments which have been proffered in opposition to medical aid in dying. And each of those arguments, and I believe I provided an article which I wrote on this, can be, I believe, relatively easily refuted. So let me just talk about a few of them, which I haven't yet covered. I've covered some of them. One is that we should not allow medical aid in dying until all patients have adequate access to quality palliative care and hospice care. The concern about lack of access to quality care and palliative care is absolutely legitimate, particularly for poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, and those who live in rural areas. However, there is no evidence that patients who use medical aid in dying have been deprived of quality end-of-life care. So there is no good reason to prevent patients from dying by medical aid in dying just because there are other patients, not these, who do not have access to quality care. And as mentioned before, most patients are enrolled in hospice when they die by medical aid in dying, receiving the gold standard of end-of-life care. And by the way, we at End of Life Choices New York highly recommend hospice. It has a very high satisfactory rating by patients and family members of patients. And so I urge you to consider enrolling in hospice yourselves or having loved ones enroll in hospice when they are within 6 months of dying. Unfortunately, hospice in this country is underutilized. Only about 50% of people die in hospice. I think it should be about 70 or 80%. Most people want to die in their own homes. Hospice can be provided there. And in New York, we are the second worst state in the whole country when it comes to hospice utilization. Only 30% of people in New York State die enrolled in hospice. There are many reasons for that, which I won't go into. But again, think about, and you can self-enroll, by the way. You don't need to have a doctor's referral. And too many doctors in New York are not referring their patients to hospice, either at all or in a timely fashion. Okay, back to medical aid in dying. The argument is that, another argument is that most people who end their lives by medical aid in dying do so primarily because of an uncontrollable pain or other symptoms. Well, that may be true, but so what? It shouldn't matter. If people are suffering, it shouldn't matter the nature of their suffering. They should be able to end their suffering if they are terminally ill and are clearly going to die within months. And I should mention that because life is so precious, I can tell you from experience and from all the reports that have been done, that people who end their lives by medical aid in dying really don't want to die. And they live until they're very close to dying, usually within days or weeks, while they still can swallow the medications and while they still have decision-making capacity. There is an argument that's made against medical aid in dying. Prognostications by physicians are not always accurate. So patients might end their lives prematurely by MAID, or medical aid in dying. I might use the word MAID as an abbreviation. While doctors far more often predict that patients will live longer than they actually do, even more importantly, patients who choose the option of MAID almost always wait until they're quite close to death, as I just mentioned. So the issue of inaccurate prognostication is not relevant in the context of MAID. Consider, too, that the process usually takes 7 weeks from the time the first request is made until the drugs are taken, if ever. Clearly, patients should be able to make end-of-life decisions, and MAID in particular based on the prognostications of 2 doctors, just as they can make decisions to hasten their death by stopping or never starting life-sustaining treatments. And they can do that even if they're not terminally ill. You can stop treatments even if it may cause you to be terminally ill, and even if you will die as a result of stopping those treatments, even if you are not otherwise terminally ill. So last argument I'm going to mention is the right to die made in accordance with one's values may become instead a duty to die. This is really an absurd argument, but it's made over and over again. At least since 1990, patients have had the right to die by stopping or never starting treatment, as I've mentioned. Any adult patient with decision-making capacity can reject any treatment at any time. This right even extends to those who are not terminally ill, as I just mentioned. So there is really not any evidence whatsoever that people are thinking they may have the duty to die. And in fact, it's very few people, about 3 out of 1,000, who die by medical aid in dying. And I believe that's largely because life is so precious for the vast majority of us, and we don't want to die. And so very few of us are going to choose this option. It's only going to be for people who are really suffering terribly at the end of life. So I'm just going to talk for another few minutes and mention again what is necessary. You have to have capacity. You have to act voluntarily. You cannot be coerced. You have to submit an oral request. That has to be done in every state. You have to submit a written request, witnessed by 2 people who attest to the fact that you are decisionally capable and you appear to be terminally ill. So only patients who have been found to be terminally ill and have capacity may proceed. The patient, of course, may rescind his or her request at any time, and the patient must self-administer the medication, as I mentioned earlier. Actions in accordance with the law shall not be considered suicide, assisted suicide, attempted suicide, promoting a suicide attempt, mercy killing, or homicide. A death by medical aid in dying on the certificate shall specify that the underlying terminal illness was the cause of death. Physicians and other healthcare providers don't have to participate, and they're protected from civil, criminal, and professional liability. The sale of insurance, of physician malpractice insurance or rate changes cannot be conditioned on or affected by whether the insured participates in medical aid in dying. So there are many, many safeguards and protections in the Medical Aid in Dying Act. Another couple are if a healthcare facility prohibits medical aid in dying and informs its employees in writing, an employee who violates that prohibition may be subject to sanctions by the employer. So there are many, many good reasons as to why medical aid in dying should be an option for terminally ill, mentally competent adult patients. Most importantly, there is overwhelming evidence that proves that it is a safe, ethical medical practice that benefits patients and causes no harm. There are simply no compelling arguments in opposition. So thank you very much for your attention. And before I conclude, please contact me if you have any questions or concerns. I know we're going to have a period of time for questions and answers. You can reach me at 914-907-6156, 914-907-6156, or my personal email address is easiest. My name with middle initial, David C. Levin, L-E-V-E-N, at AOL.com. And the last thing, again, I'm going to ask for all of you to do is to first to take a position, as I think the Ethical Culture Society do, as New York State Ethical Culture Society has done in support of medical aid in dying, and to communicate that support to the governor, to legislative leaders, to your own legislators. And for each of you to contact your legislators to ask them to support medical aid in dying. Call their office and just simply say, I support the Medical Aid in Dying Act, and I hope that, that my senator or assembly member will do the same. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.